real pleasure to be here at TESOL. Thank you to Margaret and to Dan for giving me the opportunity to talk to you. Before this event, I'd only ever visited Toronto once before, and that was when a friend and I drove coast to coast in a rusty Chevrolet 20 years ago. So it's great to be back here, a little bit older, a little bit greyer, and absolutely no wiser at all. Anyway,
I'll do that again.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay,
absolutely.
Well, you're wiser. You're right.
So I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about student pilots and controllers, and these are the things I'd like to cover. Why we're interested in students, why ICAO Level 4 is an inappropriate target for student pilots and controllers, a little research that we did into levels that are possibly appropriate for student pilots and controllers, and what we're doing at Latitude to address those needs. So firstly, why are we interested in students? Well, over the years we began to notice a decline in requests for language training for licensed pilots and controllers, presumably because the ICAO LPRs were bedding in around the world. But at the same time, we started to see an increase in requests for training for student pilots and controllers. And alongside this were predictions of stratospheric growth in the aviation industry and a concern across the industry that there are simply not enough people to fly the aeroplanes and not enough people to stop them from bumping into each other. So let's have a very quick look at some of the figures here, which are frankly formidable. In 2010, ICAO forecasted that the population of pilots and controllers would more than double in the next 15 years. In 2011, Boeing predicted a demand for 533,200 new pilots worldwide by 2030. And last year, Airbus's global market forecast repeated a similar message. So huge growth. Now, the majority of today's aviation personnel do not have English as a first language. And looking at the forecasts, we can see that the same will be true, if not more true, in the future. Now, at the same time, much of the world's aviation training is conducted in the English-speaking world. And for the aviation training that's not conducted in the English-speaking world, much of that training is conducted in English. So in order for the industry to grow, a lot of personnel need to be trained, and the language of that training will invariably be English. And finally, we're interested in students because apart from anything else, it's nice to deal with the next generation and to be working with those people who might fly my kids out to Canada so they can drive rusty Chevrolets around the country. So unlike the ICAO requirements, training for students is not covered by an industry-wide regulation. Here, training is much more about training efficiency. Let's look at this in a little more detail. In most countries, the first months of pilot and air traffic control training is spent entirely in the classroom, preparing for written examinations. This involves listening to instructors and reading technical manuals on a broad range of subjects, from principles of flight and rules of the air to meteorology and human factors. Now, here's an example of some of the training manuals that student airline pilots learning on the European model have to read and digest, and this is before they even get a sniff of an aircraft. Now, it's no mean feat that students are able to cope with this heavy training load, let alone to be able to do it in their second language. In North America, and anywhere operating on a US-based model, things are a bit different. Students tend to get into the aircraft with the instructor much earlier in their training program, which is an obvious safety issue. However, the instructor will maintain command of the aircraft. So the most important thing for the student is to benefit from the training that they're undergoing, which means to understand that instructor in the briefing room before the aircraft takes off and in the cockpit while the aircraft is flying. A steep turn in a Cessna 152 is absolutely no place for an English language lesson. Neither the student nor the training organisation wants to fall behind on account of language proficiency and to bear the costs associated with disruption or repeat training, or worse still, have a safety incident on account of poor English. So it's important that students start on day one with the right skills at the right level. Now, it's worth bearing in mind that in the USA, commercial flight training may cost the individual up to $60,000 US. In Europe, that figure can be double that. So it's extremely expensive and the stakes are high. So let's have a quick look at why ICAO is an inappropriate target level. Firstly, ICAO talk about language used for radio telephony communications, as we've heard in the previous presentations. Furthermore, ICAO talks about aeronautical radio telephony focus and that the rating scale addresses work-related aviation context, voice-only communications, and RT in the case of complications or unexpected turns of events. Now, here's my first point. How could a student, 19, 20 years old, doesn't know anything about aviation at all, how could they be expected to be able to communicate in the context of RT communications? Here are 5 of the 6 ICAO criteria at level 4. Structure and vocabulary refer to unusual or unexpected circumstances, which could mean anything from unruly passengers to foreign objects on the runway to a full-blown emergency such as a depressurization or a bird strike. Fluency refers to a transition from rehearsed or formulaic speech to spontaneous interaction, which in the context of RT communications can only mean the switch between standard RT phraseology and plain language. Vocabulary and comprehension both refer to work-related topics, and comprehension and interactions both refer to unexpected turns of events. Now, can we expect a student to be able to do these things when they haven't yet begun training and they don't have the subject matter knowledge? ICAO state quite clearly that ICAO level 4 is the minimum level required for RT communications. And crucially, ICAO also states that the rating scale does not address the skill of reading, which is crucial for successful aviation training. Now, using the ICAO rating scale for ab initio pilots and controllers is a little bit like putting the cart before the horse. But in terms of skills, it's the wrong cart altogether. Now, here's the paradox. Let's have a look at some of the entry requirements that flight schools and air traffic control training organisations ask of their students. Here's one for a national flag carrying airline's future pilot programme, and I won't tell you which airline it is, but you can see here that they are asking students to be fluent in English, verbal and written, to ICAO level 6 minimum.
This means to get into the training.
To get into the training. So you know nothing about aviation, but you've got to have ICAO level 6. Here's another one. Minimum entry requirements, and here again in yellow, foreign students, not native speakers, they're of course okay, aren't they? Foreign students will be required to pass an English language proficiency test to at least ICAO level 4, and this can also be done by the flight training organisation. And here's one from an air traffic control training organisation who are also asking for English language proficiency minimum ICAO level 4. These entry requirements made us realise that the ICAO requirements are hugely misunderstood across the industry, and they also made us realise that we needed to look a little bit more into what the real requirements of pilots and controllers are when they begin their training in the medium of English. And to do this, being from Europe, we looked at the Common European Framework of Reference and we turned to experts in the aviation training industry. We asked 14 instructors from 3 well-known providers of English medium aviation training to complete an expert judgment exercise for us. We gave them 11 listening and reading tasks across 53 descriptors, and we presented the levels A2, B1 and B2. Now, we didn't present C1 and C2 for 2 reasons. Firstly, B2 is a commonly accepted entry requirement for undergraduate education across Europe and increasingly in other parts of the world as well. And also, if we had introduced C1+, then naturally the judges would have erred towards selecting those, which would have overinflated perceived levels of the requirements for English medium training, above that which is realistic for many non-native English speakers. Let's have a look at one of these tasks, in this case listening as a member of a live audience. Now the first thing we did here was to ask the judge, is this task relevant to flight training? And in this case, as you would expect, all of them said, yes, it is. That's what happens in the classroom. The next thing we did was to give them 3 levels to choose or to link to the descriptors. Firstly, the student is not ready for English medium training. Secondly, they are borderline, so they may be okay, but at the same time they may struggle with language once they begin training. And then finally, the student is ready for English medium aviation training. So we gave them the 3 descriptors, we mixed them up and we didn't tell them what level they were, and we asked them to link the descriptors to not ready, borderline, or ready. And here are the results. We can see that 13 of the 14 judges decided that descriptor 1 described somebody who was ready. The second descriptor, opinion, was a bit divided. And the third descriptor, the majority decided that this applied to a student who is not ready for English medium aviation training. And here are the levels. So B2, B1 and A2. And we repeated this across all 53 tasks in listening and reading. And the results were very similar across all tasks. So from this expert judgment exercise, we were able to begin to understand that B2 is in the region of somebody who is ready to begin English medium aviation training, either for flight or for air traffic control. So this brings me on to my final point, which is what we're doing at Latitude to address these needs. Well, firstly, we've developed, trialled and launched a computer-based language proficiency test of listening, reading and speaking, which measures readiness for English medium aviation training. The test takes 90 minutes and it produces a score on a traffic light system with red for no, yellow for borderline, so they may struggle with language once they begin training, and then green for go. We've worked very closely with in-house and external subject matter experts in the development of the texts, the items and the rating scale, and we've been really pleased to have the involvement of the former head of international training at UK Air Traffic Services and the former director of commercial services at Europe's largest flight training organisation. With the test, we've done all of the standard stuff, analysis of reliability of the listening and reading tests and of raters in the speaking tests, and we're just coming up on our first operational review of test content and specifications since we launched the test last September. There's lots to do, but we're pleased with the results so far. Secondly, we're now working on Foundation, which is a blended learning course comprised of self-access e-learning and virtual instructor-led training. The course is comprised of 15 modules, each one linked thematically to subjects which are common to both pilots and air traffic controllers during training. Each unit has either a listening text featuring exchanges between instructors and students, or a reading text featuring content from training manuals, aircraft equipment documentation, regulatory documentation, safety reports, and industry journals. These texts are used to present language as it naturally occurs in aviation training, and the accompanying activities allow the learner to explore meaning, grammatical structure, vocabulary, and pronunciation. The virtual instructor-led component of the course is designed to bring all of this self-access learning to life. For every 7 hours of self-access learning, students will spend 3 hours in our 3D virtual environment, activating the grammar, vocabulary, pronunciation in oral interaction tasks with other students and with specialist instructors. The Virtual Academy allows us to reach out to students before they've even set foot on foreign soil. And as we're not occupying classroom space, and as the students aren't paying for meals and accommodation away from home, the Virtual Academy allows us to keep costs of delivery to a minimum. And this is important because aviation training is already extremely expensive, and any additional costs to the flight training organisation, to the students or to their sponsors is scrutinised very carefully indeed. Now, in terms of language content, what we know is that aviation English training for students is absolutely not about RT communications in non-routine situations. It's not about engine fires and depressurizations. Consequently, much of the aviation English material currently available is inappropriate to the target audience. So what are we actually training then? Well, aviation is chock full of lots of jargon and abbreviations specific to the domain. But surprisingly, at entry level, it's much more about the key language, which is to do with science, physics, maths, processes, relationships between phenomena, and importantly, rules. So what we need to do, as we're dealing with students who don't know anything about the domain, is tread this very careful tightrope between dealing with subject matter content on one hand, but with a focus on language learning on the other, and to manage that delicate interplay which necessarily involves very close involvement with subject matter experts. Now, I've been going on for long enough already, so to very quickly wrap up here, the population of pilots and controllers is set to double in the next 20 years or so, and the majority of these personnel will train in the medium of English, but will not have English as a first language. The ICAO LPRs do not address the needs of students, both in terms of skills and in terms of the requirement for subject matter knowledge at ICAO Level 4. To cope with English medium aviation training, students need equivalent to CEFR B2, particularly in reading and listening, and specific purpose preparatory English language training and assessment is, of course, essential to successful English medium aviation training. I look forward to your questions and thank you for listening.